This episode is brought to you in partnership with the Mighty Arrow Family Foundation. To whom much is given, much is expected. This value guides the philosophy behind the Mighty Arrow Family Foundation today. Committed to its cause and infused with the entrepreneurial spirit, Mighty Arrow aims to invest in solutions that take action on climate change to build a more vibrant future, repair relationships from farm to market to table, heal our connection to the lands and waters we call home, and demand a more just and equitable society. To learn more about Mighty Arrow's forward-thinking, optimistic, and visionary work here in the American West and beyond, please visit www.mightyarrow.org. This is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson. My guest today is Mike DeHoff. Mike is the Principal Investigator at Returning Rapids Project, a one-of-a-kind initiative that's documenting the recovery of the Colorado River in Cataract Canyon, Upper Glen Canyon, and along the San Juan. Back in 1963, the construction of the Glen Canyon Dam created Lake Powell, which submerged many of the area's canyons, turning what were once wild stretches of the Colorado into flat water. Today, the Southwest's ongoing historic drought has caused Lake Powell's water levels to drop significantly, revealing historic rapids, recently hidden geologic features, and riparian ecosystems that had been deep underwater for nearly 50 years. Returning Rapids began as a personal project for Mike and three of his river-loving friends, Meg Flynn, Peter Lefebvre, and Chris Benson. They began to notice changes in the river created by Lake Powell's receding waters, and started documenting those changes and using historic photographs and documents to better understand the Reemerging landscape. Over the years, their work caught the attention of universities, academics, scientists, and government agencies, all of whom were fascinated by what was being discovered deep in those canyons. Fast forward to today, and their work is not only enabling cutting-edge research, but is capturing the attention of big-time media outlets, including a recent feature in Rolling Stone. Mike was nice enough to connect with me virtually from his home base in Moab, Utah, and we had a fascinating discussion about the Colorado River, Lake Powell, and the history of the Returning Rapids Project. We started out with a brief history lesson on the drought's effects on the Colorado River. Then we dug into issues such as the mind-blowing amount of sediment created by the Glen Canyon Dam. We talk about when Mike and his partners realized that their personal project was capturing the attention of the public, the challenges of garnering attention for lesser-known places like Cataract Canyon, and the idea of combining Lake Powell and Lake Meade. We also talk a lot about Mike's personal journey with this project and how his willingness to follow his curiosity, partner with very smart people, take risks, and work extremely hard has had a significant scientific impact. We also talk about books, his mentors, his desire to learn from everyone he meets, and much more. A huge thanks to Mike, Meg, Peter, and Chris for all of their important work with Returning Rapids and for providing such a solid example for all of us who feel drawn to make a difference here in the American West. Hope you enjoyed. Mike, I'm very, very happy to be chatting with you. We had a great phone call. I guess it was last week, and now we're having another fun conversation. Only this time we're recording it. But as I've told you a million times, I'm so impressed with everything you're doing. I've loved digging in to all the work that you and your team have been up to, and I'm so excited for the listeners to get a chance to learn about everything y'all are doing. And I was wondering if we could just start at the very beginning of the story. I know it's a story you've told a million times, but you're really good at telling it. And could you just talk about the drought of 2001, 2002, and how that kind of started this whole journey you've been on over the last 20 plus years?
Well, first off, Ed, it's great to be here. Thank you very much for having myself and being able to showcase our research team and our project on your show. I think it's worth going back even further into the 90s because it leads up into everything we saw in the early 2000s. So
yeah, definitely.
When I first ran Cataract Canyon in the early 90s, the reservoir is relatively full. And on the maps back then, when you are going through Cataract Canyon, you're scouting one of the biggest rapids, the 23rd rapid in Cataract Canyon, which is called Satan's Gutter, the Big Drops. And below that rapid, there still may be one or two more rapids that aren't affected by the reservoir. But back then, you very often would run one of the biggest rapids, go down around the corner, and you would see the river just slow and drop all its color. It would go from a, classic Colorado red-brown to kind of a bluer greenish water. And you'd get motors out and hang them on the back of your rafts. And then you'd motor for a day or a day and a half to get out to the Hype Marina area.
Okay.
And as you're doing that, you can't help but be looking at the map. And back then, all the area on the map that you would be motoring across was just marked as areas affected or inundated by Lake Powell. You can't help but have a curiosity of, well, what was down there? What was it like? How many rapids were there in Cataract Canyon? What really was lost when this area was inundated? So then it gets to your question about what happened in 2002 to 2004. In 2002, the winter of 2002 to 2003 had only a 30% snowpack, 30% of average. And so from that year until you get to 2004, we saw Lake Powell Reservoir drop 150 feet and everything changed so much. It was weird in terms of what was reservoir water turned into this, what we just call like a mud canal, this weird flume through this mud-filled canyon where it wasn't safe to get out of your boat in places. It was hard to find places to camp. It was changing every week. And as someone who ran that river on a regular basis, watching that change was both fascinating and terrifying. Peter Lefebvre, who's one of our project members, he was working as a commercial guide during that time also, and he likes to describe it as people would really enjoy the big beaches in Cataract Canyon and the non-reservoir affected areas, and you'd get below the rapids and get down to this area that's affected by this giant sediment plug that was caused by the reservoir. And people would be like, Pete would say that he would pull over and say, okay, everybody, this is where we're camping. And some of the clients would be like, heck no, you're joking, right? We're not camping in this wasteland.
Swamp.
Yeah. People would demand to end the trip early and go back to Moab. People would just say, no, I'm not camping here. And it would take a lot of time to convince folks. I was working more for outdoor adventure and experiential education company then. So it was a little easier to say, no, it's character building to camp on stuff like this. But the change was drastic back then. And I think that a lot of us didn't realize the significance of that change, where we saw, a quarter of the capacity or more of the reservoir go away over a few years, to the point that now these days we're down to somewhere between 30 and 40% capacity in Reservoir Powell.
It's so wild.
Yeah. But I started in 2013. I've always had a fascination for old maps and old guidebooks. And in 2013, I started keeping some of my own note on what was going on in Cataract Canyon. And about that time, I often volunteer for Canyonlands National Park for their river shop. And we were going out to one of the put-ins with a bunch of the river shop crew. And the person who was driving us out there just so happened to be the person in charge of the river permit, issuing the permits, the permit office. And he was saying, boy, there's so much changing down in Lower Cataract Canyon. I wish we had a way to inform our visitors about it in a better way. And I said, well, I've been keeping notes on stuff. And I actually generated a little spreadsheet for them kind of talking about reservoir level and different rapids that we might see coming back. And I started providing that information to the reservation office at Canyonlands. And then really is when I started having the welding business that I started in 2012 really start to take off. And I met a river guide by the name of Peter Lefebvre. And Pete and I found that we both had a similar curiosity of what is going on in Cataract Canyon. What are all these changes going to lead to? And so we just started, comparing notes, talking about things in just such a casual way. And one day Pete came into the shop and said, hey, there are rocks above Gypsum Canyon. And we had been talking, there was this notorious rapid at the mouth of Gypsum Canyon prior to the reservoir. And we've always been wondering, when is that going to come back? So Pete came back from a trip and said, there are rocks coming out. I think something's happening. And so that was really when we started wondering if we shouldn't be looking at things a little bit more seriously. Around that time, my wife and also a member of our research team, Meg Flynn, was studying to get her master's of library science. One of the things that Meg is so good at is helping people find the right information that they need. And to help me get information, but also I think to distract me so she could actually get stuff done related to her project, Meg would find all these online resources of historic river photos and information about Cataract Canyon and say, here, go check this out. And so I would spend all this time rifling through, finding pictures of Gypsum Canyon Rapid, of other rapids near that area that we thought might be coming back, and working in a welding shop that fabricated stuff for the river running industry. You would have this endless stream of people coming through that interact with the river in different ways. We would have USGS scientists, private users, commercial river runners, someone who's never run any stretch of the Colorado before, to people who know it like the back of their hand, walking in and out of the door. And you can't help but talking about how are trips, what's going on, what are you curious about right now? Just like you, I love to just talk to people and hear what perspective they have about certain things, or what excites them about what's going on in their life right now. And one of our customers said, have you ever seen a Les Jones scroll map? And being a map nut, I was like, no, I haven't. And he brought in this map that literally looks like a scroll, where it's 2 rolls of paper, but yet when you roll it out, it's this map that's about, I think, 9 or 10 feet long. And on that map, there is a topographic representation in terms of a bird's eye view of Cataract Canyon. But then there's also what's called a river profile. And that a river profile is a means to represent the gradient and, in a vertical sense, of the loss of elevation per mile as a river flows across the landscape.
Oh, yeah. I saw you in some of your online presentations. I'll link to some of those or embed the videos, but they're really great. You're doing kind of like a PowerPoint or a Zoom presentation on it, and it gives a really good visual of what you're talking about. So I'll link to that so people can watch. But sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, and I thought it was really interesting. In me and my river running career, I had never seen a profile before. And so I was fascinated about how that information can be represented, because when you see how a river loses elevation, it's another way to understand the characteristics of it. But on this particular very long scroll map, marked also was all the locations of every rapid in Cataract Canyon before the reservoir. And so this really became a bit of a treasure map of ours. We could go in and we could look and see the elevation and overall capacity, or how full is it, is represented in Lake Powell based on elevation. And if you have a river profile that also says, oh, this rapid Big Drop 3 is at this elevation above sea level, you can correspond the two to say, if the reservoir is down to 3550, and we know that Gypsum Canyon Rapid, the top of it, shown on this Les Jones scroll map, is 3,615 feet above sea level, that rapid should be back then.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so we would go out and be like, something's not matching up here. There's all this mud. And so what had happened is, when Lake Powell was completely full, the rivers of the Southwest carry a tremendous amount of sediment. The Colorado and the San Juan River are very sediment laden, and a moving body of water can carry sediment, a still body of water can't. And one of the things that the dam builders of the Southwest of the Colorado River system wanted to use reservoirs as is a means to trap sediment. And an ideal way to have the longest life for a reservoir is to trap sediment as far up and as far away from the dam as you can, so that water rests near the dam and can be drawn through the dam. And the sediment is as far away from the dam as possible because you'll get the greatest amount of life. Well, in terms of the landscape of the basin that Glen Canyon Dam created, a giant settling pond, in a way it's ideal because you can have the river lose its sediment load 170, 180 miles upstream from your dam, and then you can draw water away. And as people design those dams, they design the system as a means to extract water from the Colorado River. And I think it would be unfair to say there was no thought to managing sediment, because the thought to managing sediment is let it just fall out far away from the dam and lay in a part of the reservoir that no one's really going to care about. Well, when all that dewatering happened in the early 2000s, that sediment delta was exposed. And the Colorado River had to start reworking it, remobilizing it. And that really is one of the big questions of our project is who manages the mud? Who's responsible for what I call the tailings pile of mining the Colorado for its water?
I thought that was really interesting. I saw that in some article I found is you've got this just unbelievably massive amount of sediment, just, a new landmass that is formed, and nobody takes responsibility. There's no real understanding of who is responsible for it. And that just seems, and is that because of just a lack of management or a lack of foresight or just not wanting to look ahead? Because you mentioned Floyd Dominy and in Encounters with the Arch Druid, which is one of my favorite books. I love that book. And just almost like there was a dismissive tone to, we don't need to worry about sediment. Yep. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, I think that what you're pointing at is, I think, something that all of the Southwest is coming to a reckoning of. And that mentality is like, we don't need to worry about it yet. Let generations of the future worry about all that sediment that's piled up in Cataract Canyon. That, when you really go back and look at some of the back and forth between Brower and Dominy in the Encounters with the Arch Druid, Brower likes to bring up, what about sedimentation? It's going to happen a lot faster than you think. And Dominy says it's not going to be an issue for hundreds of years into the future. Yeah. And interestingly enough, when we first started working with various other scientists, we had a USGS scientist on a boat with us near Gypsum Canyon. And the question he asked while we were looking at this 90-foot tall sediment bank that is out of the river, that is laid across the landscape. It's this massive deposit. And he said, what do you guys call that? And we were like, we just call it the Lake Powell Formation. And he said, I don't like that. He said, John Wesley Powell's name has been discredited enough in a lot of different ways. And naming a reservoir where his suggestions would be to never have it here is kind of an insult to him. And so I think one of us said, okay, so who was the person who was in charge of Glen Canyon Dam and who really pushed it through? And someone else said Floyd Dominy. And then it was like, okay, so let's call this the Dominy Formation.
I love that.
And in a way, we're giving credit where credit is due, because a very pushy, bullying Bureau of Reclamation commissioner said, we don't need to worry about this at all. It's not going to be an issue. It's in a way fitting to say this is the Floyd Dominy Formation and give credit where credit is due. And I think like it's one of these big questions for all of us who live in the Southwest. And I think that is like, are we okay with this amount of byproduct and this amount of impact to the land to enjoy the lifestyles that we currently want to enjoy? And I really raise the question to people of, hey, this is happening on your national parks. Canyonlands National Park is a park unit. Glen Canyon National Recreation Area is a park unit. And there is this massive tailings pile that is the byproduct of us taking water from the Colorado River that is degrading resources out there and is causing, both a lot of like direct cost to especially Glen Canyon National Recreation Area, to impacting historic, cultural resources, recreation resources, ecosystem resources in such a way that I don't know if the public's aware of that. And so I think that people really need to be aware that the way we are managing the Colorado River is having a great impact to it. And everybody is entitled to have whatever amount of opinion they want to have on that. I think what we do as a research team is try to tell the story of what we're seeing and let people are smart. They could come to their own conclusions and justify their own beliefs, opinions, thoughts. That's all fine. And so in that, for us, Peter, Meg, myself, back when things first started, there was this gentleman named Bego Gerhardt who was really enthused and had a lot of historic information for us. And then we brought on this other gentleman, Chris Benson. Chris Benson was the only trained scientist of our group. He's trained as a geologist. He's a brilliant person. He's a pilot. And we really started to follow our own curiosities in terms of we're seeing rapids come back at an astounding rate. We have all this great historic information about what Cataract Canyon looked like prior to Lake Powell. And we started just following our curiosities and looking at stuff.
Quick question about that. When did it cross over, at least in your consciousness and your team's consciousness, like, all right, we're following our curiosity. We're super passionate about this, kind of obsessed. And then at some point, outsiders started noticing, whether that was the media or even more interestingly, a lot of kind of a wide range of academic people started noticing what y'all were doing. When did that shift happen?
Initially we would say, we go on river trips, we take historic photos with us that we match. And so we go boating, we take pictures. We like to simplify things as much as we can. When we did our first science trip in 2019, there was a bunch of great multidisciplinary scientists on this trip that the University of Utah organized. And on that trip, there was a gentleman by the name of Scott Hoenick. Scott Hoenick is this incredible USGS scientist who works for the Utah Water Science Center. And he's quite a character. He's almost like a walking, talking anime figure sometimes. He's a personality that is a brilliant genius and someone I admire. And it's just another one of these great people that we've met along the way. But Scott was really like, hey, we need to start understanding rates of change. And to do that, we need to start having instruments to be able to measure stuff. We need dates, and we need to really start monitoring this stuff more closely because this stuff is fascinating. And up to that point, there were a lot of people that just were like, yeah, things are changing really fast in Cataract Canyon, but we had no way to quantify it. And right about that time also, we had a lot of other river guides coming through our shop. And I was starting to keep a giant, I guess you could say it was a PowerPoint file of all the historic pictures I've found in Cataract Canyon. And then we'd go out and look and try to match them. Well, we would have guides coming in and asking to borrow that packet of papers when they were going down Cataract Canyon because they wanted to be able to look at them and see them. So what we found is that our curiosity was shared by a lot of other people. And so I then came up with the idea of putting it all into a binder and having it be this, what is now an annual publication of our field binder, where we use this publication to tell the story of what we're seeing and what was historically present in Cataract Canyon. I mean, all this goes back to keep in mind that Glen Canyon Dam and Lake Powell, there was never an environmental impact statement done for it.
Oh, really?
Yes. The reason why we have NEPA is because of Glen Canyon Dam, is because no one really went through and weighed the impacts versus the benefits. The amount of stuff that was lost and impacted by Glen Canyon Dam and the resulting impoundment of the Colorado and San Juan rivers to create Lake Powell, we never completely understood what the impacts were going to be. And to my opinion, I think we still don't. And if anything, our project sort of backfills that. Now, to give certain efforts credit, there were hasty surveys done in the areas to be affected by Lake Powell. But those hasty surveys are outright apologetic about how they could never cover all the different things that were going to be impacted. So Glen Canyon Dam, in terms of like the amount ecological impact, we'll never know. But based on rough guesses, it is probably one of the biggest ecological impacts to ever happen west of the Mississippi, as far as like in a landmass, the amount of ecosystem, cultural, historic sites impacting a unique landscape. It blows my mind sometimes that then we turned around and made it into a national park unit, because it's just such a contrary thing. And those impacts are still going on today. That's a really important thing that I think your listeners should know, is that the impacts of how we manage the Colorado River are still going on. And that's where I think we really need to weigh, living in the Southwest, is how we manage that and the impacts worth the trade-off, or can we change our ways? I think in 2019, when we first started publishing our first field binder, we changed a little bit of the basic mantra of our project from we go boating, we take pictures, to we go boating, we take pictures, we tell the story.
And can you talk a bit about how, there's obviously just these unbelievably catastrophic impacts, and some of the cultural stuff, unfortunately, is gone for good. But when we were talking the other day, you were talking a bit about how surprising it's been to see the river and the ecosystem kind of heal itself. And I think during COVID, we got a quick glimpse of that just on a big scale, when during those few weeks when there was no air traffic, no car traffic, nothing. And pretty quickly things started changing. People started having views of the Himalayas from, cities in India that had been, completely covered in smog. And when we were talking the other day, you were talking about kind of the surprising rate that things recover. I was wondering if you could discuss that a little bit.
On our first science trip, and with so many of the scientific folks we interact with, we had a few people who study changes in landscape, or geomorphologists, hydrologists, geologists, who were on that first science trip in 2019. And I remember two of them standing around on a beach, and one of them said, "I can't believe this place. This place is amazing." I was like, "What do you mean?" And they said, "I've studied some of the natural processes that we're looking at all my life, and I've never seen things change so fast as what I'm seeing here. Like literally on this trip, I have seen things change before my very eyes, and I can't believe it. I can't believe how fast things are changing." After that 2019 trip, when we really got into trying to monitor rates, a lot of the various scientific folks that we started working with would really help us think about how to take measurements. We then started to study a bunch of various factors, and we'd have different people of different expertise. And it would be such a great thing to be around the campfire at the end of the day, where all these different scientific data gathering efforts were underway, and people who normally work in very siloed fashions would be sitting around the campfire talking about what they saw for the day, how they can't believe the data they're getting. And one thing that really occurred to me then is like, this is how fast the river is recovering. This is a measurement through many different disciplines of how this ecosystem is returning. There is a sedimentologist who works at University of Utah. Her name is Carrie Johnson. She asked me one day, well, what are other ecosystems that we could compare what's going on the Colorado arm of Lake Powell and Cataract Canyon? What are other places we can compare that to? And I said, well, I've been down the San Juan arm a couple times. We could go look at that. And so we started doing studies on the San Juan arm. And what we found down there was very similar to what we're seeing in Cataract Canyon, that river-driven ecological change was happening. But on the San Juan arm, it was happening at an astounding rate, where the common way of thinking with sediment flats that appear after the reservoir recedes is they only get colonized by invasive species. And in a way, that's an easy justification, because if sediment flats only get colonized by invasive species, if we have a wet year and they get re-inundated, there's no harm done. There's no need to be looking at the impacts. However, on the San Juan arm, we found ourselves floating through this Garden of Eden of unmanaged, natural force-driven restoration. On the San Juan below where you normally take out this area of clay hills, there are waterfalls that serve as barriers on a lot of different means. And if you go down and you portage around them and float through what is now almost 30 miles of river below them, you see this incredible riparian system, mostly populated with native willows, privets, cottonwoods. Beavers have returned at an astounding rate. So there is this ecosystem recovery that's happening down there that no one's overseen, that no one planned out, that just is happening because there's a change in the way the reservoir lays on that landscape. It's gone away.
Wow.
But the deposited sediment serves as this nursery, this ecological succession that does start with non-native species because they are the most aggressive. So tumbleweed, tamarisk get in there, but then they provide shade for willows, cottonwoods, and privets to take hold, and other natives, and then they outcompete those. And so you are floating down a river that is lined with lush willows and cottonwoods mixed in with privet that was under 60 feet of reservoir water less than 10 years ago. It's fascinating to see. And I spend a lot of time thinking about what our cultural impact is. And I can't help but think of that when I go down our various stretches of river that we study. But, given that, we also have talked with a lot of scientists who also study climate change. And they, in the results of their data, sometimes have a hard time being hopeful. And I was talking to someone recently, and they were like, how do you find hope in the face of all this change you're seeing, in the face of all the climate change news? And I said, all I have to do is go out to our study areas, because we are seeing that natural forces exist and can recover at this astounding rate if we only give them a chance, if we change our progenic impacting ways, that there are natural forces that, whether it be a flowing river, how native plants and ecosystems return to the shoreline, it comes back at an astounding rate. It's fascinating. And so I find a lot of hope there. And it's starting to be that, I can't help but think about how lucky I am to go visit our places that we study, and how I think someone who never dips a toe in the San Juan or the Colorado River, one of the true things that our data set is really showing is that there are ways forward through this climate change issue that we are facing right now, if we only give certain forces a chance to be able to recover.
Yeah, I love that. I love the hopefulness combined with pragmatism. I think that's kind of you got to be an optimist to be doing the kind of work that you're doing, but you also don't want to, you got to have this pragmatic approach, and it seems like you have both. And so as this project has grown and captured more attention, there's a lot of, like, fundraising is a big part of what you do. And we were actually introduced through the Mighty Arrow Foundation that is very excited to fund a lot of your work. And one thing I'm wondering about is you hear so much for the average person, like say somebody sitting in Denver or even somebody sitting in New York City or LA, everybody hears about the Grand Canyon all day long. And no matter where you are in the U.S., people know about the Grand Canyon. They know about some of the issues. And I would think that could, it's not a competition, but when it comes to fundraising, sometimes it kind of is. And so I was wondering how you think about getting a spotlight on some of these lesser known, and I mean that for outside of the Southwest, but lesser known places, Cataract Canyon, the San Juan Arm, all these places where this amazing stuff is happening. How do you get people's attention away from Like, yeah, Grand Canyon's awesome. There's a lot going on there, but we're doing some cool stuff too. How do you think about that?
I went on a Grand Canyon trip this last summer.
Oh, did you really?
I couldn't help but think about how the Grand Canyon is also a park unit that's being drastically impacted by the presence of Glen Canyon Dam and how the Colorado is managed. In Cataract Canyon, we see the Colorado in its last wild free self. It fluctuates wildly. It carries a huge sediment load. It is the closest thing to the Colorado unaffected by man that there is right now. And the Colorado River through Grand Canyon is but a zombie of what we see in Cataract Canyon. And it's really sad because the ecosystem down there, the river-related ecosystems, the river corridor-related ecosystems, and cultural and historic sites are greatly affected by how the Colorado doesn't run free through Grand Canyon. It doesn't carry a sediment load. It doesn't replenish its beaches. It doesn't scour the river corridor of invasive vegetation or other vegetation to be able to allow, the big, beautiful beaches we see in Cataract Canyon. It doesn't flow in such a way that the native fish species can really prosper. But it is what it is. And that's back to I think we all need to decide how we feel about the trade-offs that we have in the Southwest. I think just telling the story of what we're seeing in the Colorado River up in Cataract and on the San Juan is intriguing because I don't think I'm the only one that has the questions of what have we done to the landscape? What are we asking of it? And how do we go forward through the climate crisis that we're getting faced with? Grand Canyon is certainly a gem of the Southwest, but the Colorado is as a whole. And I think understanding all the different parts of it really will help people understand what's going on in Grand Canyon and what's going on in other parts of the Colorado River system.
One question, it's a bit outside the scope of the specifics of your project, but I've in some of the articles I read, it was discussed, and I'd love to get your take on this idea of, solutions going forward. What do we need to do? And one of the solutions that I've seen discussed across the board is this idea of combining Lake Powell and Lake Meade. And because we don't have enough water to fill up both of them. And so it might make sense to just have one of them full. I was wondering if you could just talk a bit about that kind of decision, that debate, if you're comfortable where you stand on that. But I think that's just an interesting thing. And every time I've read about it, a lot of my career, I was in water, Western water, and some of it's still confusing to me. So if you can story tell in a way that I can understand it around that issue, I'd love to know more about that.
So we're entering into some of the ways the water law and water rights affect the Colorado River. In my mind, water law and water rights is one of the most convoluted expressions of greed that there is in the Western U.S. right now. It is mind-boggling to me. And when people really try to explain it to me, I get lost, and my mind always goes to trying to simplify things down to where I can understand them and how I could talk to other people about it. And so I just think it's an incredibly convoluted thing. When you look at Hoover Dam and the reservoir it makes, Lake Meade, and Glen Canyon Dam and the reservoir it makes, Lake Powell, the simple way that I could look at that is I like to think about it as terms of bank accounts. Imagine that you started a business and your accountant said, hey, you're going to have so much money coming in that you probably should open 2 different bank accounts. And so you do. And for a while, the cash flow and revenue is such where you're banking all that money in both accounts. And then something changes in your business and your bank accounts start to shrink. And you, in those shrinking bank accounts, take a measure of your financial situation, and you see that there are all these different banking fees going on. And those banking fees are such that they are affecting what you have as a net worth as a whole. So when you put the 2 bank accounts together, how much do you really have? Well, that's shrinking, and it's shrinking even faster from the banking fees that are being levied against you. In the example of Lake Powell and Lake Meade, those banking fees are evaporation. I think there's also all the other things that would come at you when you have shrinking bank accounts, like the stress, other impacts to your life, what have you. But the idea of, should we have one reservoir just be full to avoid some of those banking fees and other impacts, or the keep one reservoir full and let the other one go empty, because that would be a better way to manage what revenue you have coming into your bank accounts. Right now, there is this law called the interim guidelines that dictates how the two reservoirs are managed. That is being renegotiated and going to be put into another 20-year span of, it used to be that Lake Powell and Lake Meade were managed separately. And the interim guidelines came out of the drought of '02 as a means to manage the two reservoirs. They're being renegotiated right now so that there's a continued way forward to manage the two reservoirs. And there's a lot of different ideas being thrown around. One of them is to try to keep one or the other reservoir as full as it can be. Another one that is being thrown around is to bypass Glen Canyon Dam and let the river run free through Grand Canyon. Others are to keep Lake Powell as full as we can, because having that might ensure a flow through the Grand Canyon that could support some parts of its ecosystem. In short, the snow globe for the Colorado is really shaken up, and there's not much settling out right now. I think our place in all that mix is we are monitoring the reservoir affected reaches of rivers that flow into Lake Powell. And our data set that we're gathering is showing there's an incredible rate of return that can happen. And I go to, if it took us 18 years to fill Lake Powell Reservoir, once the gates of Glen Canyon Dam were closed, and we gave the river 18 years to recover if there was no reservoir there, I think everybody would be astounded at the rate of change. And so we are a research group that hopefully informs people in how they make decisions going forward, and they're big decisions that are hanging in the balance.
Yeah. And it seems that from my outsider's perspective that the changes are going to happen one way or the other. And yeah. I think I saw a quote from your partner, Peter, and he said, I feel like Mother Nature is kind of forcing the hand of people to make decisions that are really hard decisions. Yeah. And so I don't know, it just seems that so many of the decision makers, I mean, I kind of get it. I don't agree with it, but I understand their thinking of they're just trying to not deal with these things in hopes that someday somebody else will figure it out. But I think we're getting ready to reach a point where things are going to change drastically no matter what. And that the water law thing is so interesting to me. There's a book, you probably read it, called Where the Water Goes by David Owen about the Colorado River. Yeah. And he talks about the water rights, and he said the water rights system and how in his mind, if you put a bunch of grad students in a conference room in 3 hours, they could come up with a water rights system for the West that makes a lot more sense than what we have now. Wait, one question for you, kind of a big picture question. I'm just so impressed and intrigued by how you and all your colleagues just started following this thread of curiosity based on just purely what you were interested in. And now it's turned into this kind of force unto itself that's making change happen across all these different realms, whether academics, it's informing government. And it just started with y'all following your passions, which I think is so interesting. And I think a lot of people who listen to this podcast, they may be interested in land conservation, or they may be interested in wildlife conservation. But I think your story and the story of your partners is really a kind of a dream come true for a lot of folks, as far as like, what if I could do something like this, that it ends up making a big difference. And so I was wondering if I imagine you get hit up by people looking for advice, like, how'd you do it? What would be your advice, say, to somebody who's like 30 years old, has been doing, making their way in a career, have learned a few things, have an interest, and look at your story and that of your partners, and it's like, man, I would love to do something like that. Do you have any advice for people like that?
I would say that humility will get you further than expertise. and building coalitions of people and encouraging them to all work together builds momentum that is a fun thing to be a part of, and teamwork, communication, curiosity, and then really staying true to your own curiosities and what you're seeing and how to communicate them most of the time with respect, and every now and then with a little bit of WTF, we have to do something, is what I would say. I run into a lot of young people. Meg and I gave a presentation to 100 and some California students here in Moab not too long ago. And one of the students came up and said, why did we think it was right to take the entirety of the Colorado River and no longer let it do what it set out to do, which is touch the ocean? How can we be okay with that? And I think what I would tell anybody who's, less than 50, some of these younger generations who are going to have to deal with a lot of the choices that past generations made, is that we need to engage those questions these days. Like it's no longer okay for people to say, we don't need to worry about sedimentation for 100 years. It's not okay for people to make decisions, or I've run into a couple people that really leave me with the impression of there's going to be enough water till I retire, not there's going to be enough water for my grandchildren. I know a lot of young people have a lot of anxiety around climate change. I find doing stuff like what we do is a constructive way to deal with it and to engage people and say, are we okay with this issue, whatever it may be, river, water, land management, the way we treat the air, being returned like a rental car that's been beat to crap. I was talking to someone recently who said that they were talking to someone who is a First Nation member, and they said, my people, they were referring to the tribe that they are of and represent, we're a forever nation. We've been here a long time, long before you Anglos came into our world, and we're going to be here a long time after that. You people, you Anglos, the current dominant culture that you have right now, you all are in a place of deciding, are you a 200-year culture, or are you going to last longer than that? And that has resonated in my brain a lot.
That's powerful. It seems like if there's you've done a lot of cool stuff, but it seems like one of your secret ingredients is everybody you meet, just from our few conversations, it seems like you're able, you really appreciate the people that are around you, and and whether it's people you're talking to, like those California students, or somebody that, the first academic that may have approached you. I mean, it just seems like you've got a real appreciation for people at your core, if I'm reading that right. I could be wrong.
No, I think that's fair. Like I'm a weird balance where I'm a super introverted person. I really enjoy time alone just to ruminate on life and how life is going. And I've found that if I have that balance, then I could go out in the world and find value in people. Like I love going up and talking to almost anybody if they're completely different than I, and just saying, hey, what's going on in your world? And sometimes if we talk long enough, I mean, similar to what you do, Ed, is just saying, what's it like to be you? What's going on in your world?
I love it.
And I think that the more you do that, the more you can find something to admire about everybody. People who've had a really big impact on me are a lot of the people I've worked with over the years, be it working as a river guide, working for Outward Bound, working with a lot of the National Park Service folks. The National Park Service staffers we have are amazing folks. And as much as sometimes they're saddled with bureaucracy, they also deeply believe in the protect and preserve for future generations mission that they're tasked with. I think the members of our team, Peter Lefebvre is very different from me, but at the same time, we work together to make those differences really go a long way. My wife is a big inspiration to me. She has really helped me grow more than anything. Her name's Meg Flynn. She's wonderful. There's a scientist by the name of Brenda Bowen at the University of Utah. And she is someone who's become a colleague. She's someone who I've just grown to admire about how she is one of the most intelligent and effective people I've ever met, but is also just very low key and very much a casual person who just wants to do work help people understand, be the great teacher that she is to so many of the students that get to encounter her. I could keep going on and on. I would even say that the Colorado River is a big hero of mine, like that.
Yeah.
Just being in a place where I could sit and watch the river go by and know what it's capable of is something I'm still understanding, but always respecting.
I'm super introverted myself, which is people don't really believe that people that just listen to the podcast and haven't met me in person, but I have to have quiet time like you, but I also get so much. I mean, in a way, my stuff is nothing compared to what you're doing, but it's a similar thing of just following a interest. I'm interested in cool people, interesting people that are driven by this purpose to do cool stuff and do impactful work. And over 8 years or whatever, it turned into a real job, which is strange, but I feel like there's that story is told time and again. And I'm with you on the humility thing. I think humility is everything. 2 more questions for you. Seems like as a fellow introvert, you probably read a lot of books. And so I'm always looking for good book recommendations. And we've already talked about Encounters with the Arch Druid, Where the Water Goes, but they could be about rivers and water in the West, but it could be just books that have impacted your life. I imagine with your time with Outward Bound, you were teaching a lot. I mean, I bet you've got a lot of books similar to the number of heroes and mentors you have, but any books come to mind that you would recommend?
It's funny you say that. I'm sitting in the library at our house and just surrounded by books with maps. I love books with maps because they help you to understand the story in a different way. I'm such a map junkie. I think over the course of the years, my favorite book has changed so much. Have you ever read 1491 about what the quote unquote New World was like prior to Columbus arriving?
I've wanted to read it forever and I have not. It's on my list. I have not read it. Is it great?
It's a really good book. It helps you to understand and think about what things were like in South and North America prior to any effects from European exploration, colonization, settlement. It's a really good book. A fun book that we were just talking about is this book called Dead Run by Dan Schultz. And that is about these guys who stole a water truck and were going to try to use it to do some nefarious things and ended up touching off one of the biggest manhunts in the Southwest. And it's pretty interesting. I don't agree with what the guys were doing and where they were going, but it's a really interesting slice of history. I've been really into Barry Lopez lately. And I don't know if you've ever read the book Desert Notes, River Notes.
No, but everybody says I need to. Once again, I need to read it.
So in the River Notes part of the book, there is an essay called The Bend. And the language is so good. And it's so good that for me, I go sit by the river and read it out loud to myself once a year. You should do it. I tell people, like, the first time you read it, don't read it in your head. Go sit someplace and read it out loud, and then leave yourself a little bit of time to think about things, because I really like it.
I'll do that. I've got a river trip this summer. I'll make that the occasion to do it. I haven't read enough Barry Lopez. I mean, the thing is, everybody I talk to on this podcast has so many great book recommendations, and I just, I could read all day long and still not read everything I want. And when I go in a bookstore or like your library, I almost get anxious feeling because I want to I want to read all the books, and there's so much great knowledge there. Those are great books. I have links in the notes for people who are listening. Final question for you. You've accumulated so much wisdom over the years through your career and all these different threads of curiosity that you followed. And it's really inspiring on about 10 different levels to me. But I was wondering if you just had any final words of wisdom, parting thoughts, anything you'd like to ask of the people listening, anything that you'd like to kind of use to wrap this up?
Lately, I've been thinking a lot about 2 things. One, the whole concept of manifest destiny and how we think about that as something that is of the past in America. And it was a doctrine where it was used to justify one culture taking land from another culture. These days, it's also something where it justifies us taking resources out of an ecosystem like water, and how much there are threads of that in so many of our modern day climate issues. I think about that a lot. And lately, I think in terms of like simple things of what right do I have what rights do other people have, and like what rights, like does the Colorado River have a right to exist or not? And that kind of takes me back to the whole manifest destiny thing and how just complicated it all is. I think in there, though, there are also seeds for ways forward. A lot of the work that simple stuff is going out and matching photos, and the harder stuff is really trying to help, someone who's under 30 or has a lot of climate anxiety know that there are ways forward. It's just a matter of if we can only change our ways. That's what's in my mind a lot these days.
Well, Mike, you're doing inspiring work, man. Just so happy to get to know you. I hope we get to meet in person one of these days, because everything you're doing is just, I think it's very, very important work. It's having an impact. And then I think the one of the coolest parts is that it can be this ripple effect to inspire other people to go out and do their own work in whatever their passion is and whatever issue happens to capture their attention. And I really do think, I know you're just grinding and you're doing your thing, but people are watching, and I wish there was a way to measure the impact that the inspiration you're producing and that your team is producing has, because it's inspiring to me, and I know everybody else is just going to really enjoy listening to this. So thanks so much. And when I'm through Moab next, I'll look you up.
Yeah, please do. And thank you very much for the opportunity. And, I would just say to all your listeners, figure out what you could do in your little sphere to help take care of the things that you want to take care of.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number two, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number 3, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number 4, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way. So head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.